In 1875, the ruler of Egypt sold his country's shares in one of the most important pieces of infrastructure on Earth. That alone would have been strange enough. The Suez Canal had opened only 6 years earlier, cutting a new shipping route between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea and placing Egypt directly across the shortest maritime path between Europe and much of Asia. Nearly half the shares in the company belonged to the Egyptian government. And Egypt was supposed to be booming. Cotton exports had exploded, government revenue had risen, railways crossed the Nile Delta, new canals brought more land under cultivation. Cairo was being rebuilt with broad avenues, gas lights, theaters, and European-style government buildings. At the opening of Suez, thousands of guests had arrived from across Europe to watch a procession of ships enter a waterway that seemed to announce Egypt's arrival as a modern power. Now its ruler, Ismail Pasha, was desperate for cash. Britain bought the shares for roughly £4 million. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli moved so quickly that the money was advanced by the Rothschild banking house before the normal parliamentary process could even catch up. £4 million sounded enormous. Egypt owed something close to 100 million. The sale did not rescue the country. It delayed the crisis. European creditors soon gained direct control over parts of Egyptian government revenue. British and French officials moved into positions where they could inspect budgets and influence spending. Ismail tried to push them back and was removed from power under foreign pressure. Then, in July 1882, British warships appeared off Alexandria and opened fire. For hours, shells hammered the Egyptian defenses around the harbor. Smoke drifted over the waterfront. Parts of the city burned in the chaos that followed. And British troops soon began a campaign that would end with their army entering Cairo. Less than a decade separated Egypt's forced sale of the Suez shares from British occupation. And the strangest part is that the road to that disaster did not begin with Egypt becoming poor. It began when Egypt became suddenly, spectacularly rich. Today, Egyptian cotton sounds like something you find printed on the packaging of expensive bed sheets. The phrase means softness, long fibers, fine yarn, luxury. In the middle of the 19th century, those fibers became part of something much larger. A war thousands of miles away suddenly made Egyptian cotton one of the most valuable replacements for a supply chain on which British industry depended. Money poured into the country. Landowners expanded production. Alexandria filled with merchants and ships. For a few extraordinary years, cotton seemed to be giving Egypt exactly what its rulers had wanted for decades: the wealth to build a stronger, more independent state. The cotton was real. The money was real. The problem was how long everyone expected the miracle to last. The story starts well before the American Civil War, because Egypt did not suddenly discover cotton in 1861. Under Muhammad Ali, the Ottoman governor who effectively built a new Egyptian state in the early 19th century, agriculture was reorganized around the needs of government power. Muhammad Ali wanted a modern army and enough revenue to make Egypt increasingly independent from the empire that technically ruled it. He built factories, expanded irrigation, reorganized taxation, and pushed his armies so far into Ottoman territory that at one point they threatened Constantinople itself. All of that had to be paid for. Around the 1820s, Egypt found a crop Europeans were willing to pay very well for. A Frenchman named Louis Alexis Jumel became associated with the development of an unusually fine Egyptian cotton with long fibers that could be spun into smooth, strong yarn. The exact botanical history is more complicated than the old legend of one man finding a miraculous plant in a garden, but the commercial opportunity was obvious. Egypt had the Nile, it had fertile delta soil, it had Alexandria facing the Mediterranean. And with enough irrigation, cotton could be grown through the hot, dry months when water had to be deliberately carried to the fields. Muhammad Ali's government pushed the crop hard and controlled much of the trade through state monopolies. Farmers produced cotton, the government purchased it, and foreign merchants bought from the state. Cotton became one of the sources of money behind Muhammad Ali's attempt to build a powerful Egyptian military and bureaucracy. After his monopoly system weakened, private landowners and merchants gained more room to operate, but the crop kept expanding. By the middle of the century, British manufacturers already knew Egyptian cotton and valued its quality. There was only one problem if Egypt wanted to become a truly dominant supplier. The United States was producing cotton on another scale entirely. By the 1850s, Britain had built an enormous industrial system around raw fiber from the American South. Lancashire was filled with spinning mills and weaving sheds. Manchester became one of the symbols of industrial capitalism. Liverpool handled the ships, brokers, and warehouses that connected those factories to plantations across the Atlantic, and those plantations were worked by enslaved people. Across Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, and the rest of the Cotton Belt, enslaved men, women, and children planted the crop, weeded it through the heat, and picked the fiber by hand when the bolls opened. The harvest moved toward rivers and railways, then through ports such as New Orleans, Mobile, Charleston, and Savannah before crossing the Atlantic. By the eve of the Civil War, roughly 4/5 of the cotton-feeding British textile mills came from the United States. That meant one of the most advanced industrial sectors in the world depended on a raw material grown thousands of miles away inside a political system that was coming apart. In April 1861, it did. The American Civil War began, and cotton immediately became part of the conflict. Confederate leaders believed their control of the world's dominant supply might force Britain or France to support them. Europe needed cotton, they reasoned, and Europe would eventually choose its mills over its opposition to slavery. Some Southern producers withheld exports in the hope that scarcity would create diplomatic pressure. Then the Union blockade tightened around Confederate ports. Ships still slipped through, but the normal flow collapsed. Fighting disrupted transport inside the South. Ports became dangerous or inaccessible. Cotton that British manufacturers had assumed would arrive as reliably as the seasons suddenly stayed on the wrong side of the Atlantic. Lancashire felt the shock almost immediately. Mills cut hours, then mills closed. Families who depended entirely on textile wages found themselves living on relief. Men who had spent years operating spinning machinery ended up breaking stones or digging roads because local authorities needed some way to keep them employed. The crisis became known as the Lancashire Cotton Famine, and it produced one of the more remarkable political moments in this entire story. In late 1862, while the shortage was still wrecking livelihoods, working men gathered at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester and sent an address to Abraham Lincoln supporting the struggle against slavery and encouraging emancipation. Think about what they were supporting. The war that threatened slavery was also helping keep cotton out of their factories. Ending that war on terms favorable to the Union could eventually restore trade. But in the immediate present, these workers were suffering precisely because the supply from the slave South had disappeared. Lincoln wrote back, acknowledging their hardship. Confederate leaders had counted on cotton hunger to turn British workers against the Union. Many of the people actually losing wages refused to make the preservation of slavery the price of putting the machines back to work. But moral support for emancipation did not put cotton into a warehouse. British manufacturers still needed fiber. Merchants began searching almost everywhere it could be grown. India increased production. Brazil became more important. Buyers looked toward parts of the Ottoman world and any other region capable of shipping cotton quickly enough to matter. Egypt had almost everything they wanted. The crop already existed. The long staple varieties were excellent. Alexandria was connected to European markets. The Nile gave Egypt an agricultural system that could expand production far faster than a completely new cotton frontier could be created. Manchester manufacturers even pressed the Egyptian ruler, Said Pasha, to actively encourage more planting. His response was essentially that he did not have to. the price would do it for him. And it did. Cotton prices surged, and Egyptian producers reacted with astonishing speed. Between 1861 and 1865, production and exports roughly quadrupled. Fields that had produced food crops shifted toward cotton because the returns were suddenly difficult to ignore. Landowners put more acreage under cultivation. Merchants arrived in Alexandria looking for bales. European commercial houses expanded their operations. Ships that might once have expected American cotton increasingly loaded Egyptian fiber instead. In 1860, Egypt had produced around 50 million pounds of cotton. By the middle of the Civil War, production had climbed into the hundreds of millions. The Nile Delta began to look like a place that had discovered white gold. And unlike a gold rush, the treasure did not have to be found underground. It grew again every year. The boom reached government accounts. Export values soared and taxable wealth rose. Land capable of producing cotton became more valuable. Fortunes expanded in Alexandria and across the rural estates. The country was being pulled deeper into a global market whose prices were being set by a war that no Egyptian had started. A battle in Virginia could raise the value of a field beside the Nile. That is the first strange thing about the cotton boom. The second is what happened when everybody tried to plant more. Cotton needs water through the summer, and summer irrigation in 19th century Egypt was not automatic. More acreage meant more canals, more maintenance, and more control over the Nile. Earth had to be moved. Channels had to be cleared, embankments had to be repaired, existing irrigation systems had to carry water farther. All of that required labor. And the boom arrived in a countryside where labor could be compelled in more than one way. Egyptian peasants had long been subject to forms of corvée, compulsory labor demanded by the state for canals, roads, and other public works. Men could be taken away from their own fields and ordered to spend weeks digging or clearing waterways. Slavery also still existed. Enslaved Africans were brought north into Egypt through networks connected to Sudan and other regions farther south. Some worked in households, but many were also present in the countryside. When cotton prices exploded, demand for labor rose with them. Historical estimates suggest that during the peak boom years from 1861 to 1864, roughly 25 to 30,000 enslaved Africans may have been brought into Egypt each year. Modern research using Egyptian census records finds that the enslaved population grew dramatically over the middle decades of the century, and that the cotton boom increased both imported slaveholding in areas suited to cotton and state coercion of local Egyptian workers. That does not mean Egyptian cotton was simply the American plantation system transplanted to the Nile. It was not. Egypt had family farmers, tenants, wage laborers, smallholders, and large estates operating alongside coercive institutions that were different from slavery in the American South. The important point is what the boom did to those systems. It made labor more valuable, and when the people who controlled land and government had the ability to compel labor, a sudden increase in the value of cotton gave them every reason to use that power more aggressively. There is a cruel symmetry here. In Manchester, workers were suffering because slave-grown American cotton had disappeared, and many of them publicly supported emancipation anyway. At almost the same moment, the scramble to replace that cotton was increasing pressure on coerced workers and enslaved Africans in Egypt. The supply chain changed. The moral problem did not vanish with the ships leaving a different port. For the Egyptian state, though, the boom first appeared as an extraordinary opportunity. And in January 1863, right in the middle of it, Egypt got a ruler ambitious enough to bet much more than a cotton harvest on the money continuing. His name was Ismail Pasha. Ismail was 32 years old when he took power, and he inherited the central obsession of Muhammad Ali's dynasty. Egypt was still legally subordinate to the Ottoman Empire, but its rulers wanted the freedom, prestige, and military strength of an independent state. Ismail believed modernization could get him there. He wanted better infrastructure, a larger and more capable administration, schools, modern cities, and an army strong enough to project Egyptian power beyond the Nile Valley. He also wanted Europe to recognize Egypt as something more than an Ottoman province. The timing could hardly have looked better. Cotton was pouring money into the economy. Government revenues rose dramatically during Ismail's reign, from under £5 million in the mid-1860s to more than 10 million within a decade. Egypt really was becoming richer. That is what makes the next part dangerous. If Ismail had inherited an obviously bankrupt state, European lenders would have treated him differently, and he might have treated his own ambitions differently. Instead, he inherited a boom, so he began building. Hundreds of thousands of additional hectares were brought under cultivation. Irrigation works expanded. Railways pushed farther through the delta and toward Upper Egypt. Telegraph lines connected cities. Bridges and roads improved the movement of people and goods. Cairo changed so quickly that visitors could watch the 19th century being laid over the older city. Ismail had seen Paris after the great rebuilding projects of Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann, and he wanted a capital that announced the same kind of modern confidence. New districts appeared west of medieval Cairo. Broad streets cut through areas designed for carriages and modern administration. Gas lamps lit important avenues. European-style hotels, ministries, and theaters appeared near older neighborhoods that had grown over centuries. He built an opera house. He expanded schools and bureaucracy. He spent heavily on the military. Some of it was useful state building, some of it was prestige. Much of it was both at the same time, because Ismail wanted the physical transformation of Egypt to make a political argument. This was no longer a backward province. This was a country that deserved to act like a power, and Ismail was gaining real autonomy. Through negotiation and payments to Constantinople, he secured new privileges from the Ottoman Sultan. In 1867, he received the title of Khedive. Later concessions gave Egypt greater control over internal affairs and widened Ismail's freedom to borrow abroad. That last privilege would matter far more than it probably appeared to at the time. Ismail wanted freedom from Ottoman restrictions, partly so that he could raise European money without asking permission. He got it. For a while, borrowing looked like another tool of independence. Then came the project that made the whole dream visible to the world: the Suez Canal. Construction had begun before Ismail became ruler, under his predecessor Said, but Ismail inherited the enormous financial and political burden of finishing it. Ferdinand de Lesseps and the Suez Canal Company were trying to cut a navigable channel directly through the Isthmus of Suez, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. If it worked, a ship traveling between Europe and Asia would no longer need to round the southern tip of Africa. The route was obvious on a map. Building it was another matter. Early construction depended heavily on Egyptian corvée labor. Tens of thousands of peasants were compelled into excavation and earth-moving before machinery replaced more of the work. Egypt supplied land and infrastructure around the project, and disputes with the canal company over forced labor and other concessions ended in expensive compensation. Over 10 years, roughly 74 million cubic meters of earth were removed. Then, in November 1869, the canal opened. If you were trying to design a moment that made Ismail's entire project look successful, you could hardly improve on the ceremony. Around 6,000 guests came to Egypt. Empress Eugenie of France attended, along with European royalty, diplomats, and aristocrats. A procession entered the canal behind her imperial yacht, followed by 77 other ships, 50 of them warships. Ismail spent lavishly on the celebration. The message was impossible to miss. Egypt had helped create a new artery of world commerce, and the world had come to watch. Imagine what this must have looked like from Ismail's position. 8 years earlier, a war in America had suddenly made Egyptian cotton fantastically valuable. Since then, government revenue had risen, the countryside had expanded, Cairo had been transformed, and Ismail had won greater political autonomy from the Ottoman Sultan. Now European rulers were sailing through an Egyptian waterway that would shorten the distance between continents. The gamble seemed to be working. There was only one detail hiding beneath the celebration. The market that had made Ismail's first years so extraordinary was already gone. The American Civil War had ended in 1865. The Union survived. Slavery was abolished in the United States. Southern ports reopened, and American cotton gradually returned to world markets. Egyptian cotton remained valuable. Europe still wanted it, and the crop would remain central to Egypt for generations. What disappeared was the emergency. During the war, Britain had been scrambling for alternatives to the American South. Once American production returned, Egypt no longer occupied the same desperate position in the market. The extraordinary wartime prices eased. Ismail's ambitions did not. The transformation of Egypt had already acquired a momentum of its own. Railways under construction could not simply be abandoned. Irrigation projects still had to be paid for. The bureaucracy, military and court consumed money. Ismail was also pursuing Egyptian expansion deeper into Africa, trying to turn greater autonomy into greater regional power. Where cotton revenue could not cover the difference, European credit did. At first, that hardly looked like surrender. European investors saw a country with valuable exports, rapidly rising revenue, productive land, and a government willing to spend on infrastructure. Egypt had the Suez Canal running through its territory and cotton flowing out of Alexandria. On paper, it looked like an excellent borrower. So Ismail borrowed. Then he borrowed on worse terms. One loan tells you almost everything about the direction this was taking. In 1873, Egypt contracted a loan with a nominal value of £32 million. The government did not receive £32 million in usable cash. Depending on how the transaction is calculated, contemporary estimates put the amount actually realized at around 17 to 20 million. Egypt could therefore take on an obligation of 32 million while getting something much closer to half that amount into its hands. Discounts, commissions, and the structure of the loan consumed the rest, while interest and repayment obligations attached to the larger debt. This was not cheap money financing a booming economy anymore. It was a government paying heavily for access to cash because it had become difficult to slow down. And the problem fed itself. As Egypt's finances weakened, lenders demanded better protection. Better protection meant harsher terms. Harsher terms meant more future revenue had to be devoted to the debt, which made the next financial emergency harder to solve. Some new borrowing was increasingly being used to deal with obligations created by earlier borrowing. The modern Egypt Ismail was building was becoming attached to European creditors piece by piece. He was also spending on military ambition. Egyptian expansion had pushed south through Sudan and toward the Horn of Africa. Ismail wanted influence on the Red Sea and dreamed of an African empire that would confirm Egypt's status as a regional power. Then the Ethiopian campaigns went badly. In 1875, an Egyptian expedition was destroyed at Gundet. Ismail sent a larger force the following year, and that army suffered another serious defeat at Gura. The losses did not create Egypt's financial crisis, but they were one more sign of how far the project had stretched. The same ruler financing railways and irrigation at home was paying for wars abroad while servicing increasingly expensive debt. And 1875 was the year European credit became much harder to find. The Ottoman Empire itself was sliding toward default. Financial confidence across Europe had been shaken by the panic that began in 1873. Investors who had once treated Egypt as an exciting growth story were now asking whether Ismail could actually pay them. He needed cash. That brings us back to the Suez shares. Only 6 years earlier, Ismail had spent a fortune entertaining thousands of guests at the canal's opening. Now Egypt's stake in the company was one of the few assets valuable enough to bring in money quickly. Britain recognized the opportunity immediately. The British government had originally opposed the canal project, partly because of French influence and concerns about the route to India. Once Suez was open, British ships became some of its most important users. Whatever London had thought about the project in the 1850s, by the 1870s the canal was becoming far too useful to ignore. Disraeli wanted the Egyptian shares before another buyer could take them. The usual parliamentary machinery was too slow for the deal. Lionel de Rothschild's banking house advanced roughly £4 million to the British government, allowing the purchase to go forward quickly. The shares represented about 44% of the Suez Canal Company. London celebrated. Ismail got his money, and the basic arithmetic was brutal. The sale brought in about £4 million, while Egypt's debts had grown to many times that amount. An asset associated with the greatest celebration of Ismail's reign had been sold to keep the government alive a little longer. It was not enough. By 1876, Egypt could no longer continue managing its obligations in the old way. European creditors wanted something more reliable than promises from the Khedive, so they began claiming the revenues behind those promises. The Caisse de la Dette Publique, the Public Debt Commission, was created to supervise money assigned to debt repayment. Foreign commissioners gained control over specified streams of Egyptian income. This sounds dry until you look at what those streams actually were. Revenue from railways could be pledged. Income from the port of Alexandria could be pledged. Taxes collected inside Egypt could be committed to creditors before the Egyptian government had much freedom to decide where the money should go. The very infrastructure Ismail had built to strengthen the country could now serve as security for the debt accumulated while building it, and the amount being consumed was extraordinary. By 1877, more than 60% of Egyptian government revenue was going towards servicing the national debt. That meant the financial crisis could no longer stay inside European banks. Egyptian officials felt it in salaries and dismissals. The army felt it in cuts. Landowners saw a government desperate for revenue. The Assembly of Delegates began demanding more control over public finances. Then foreign supervision became impossible to hide. European officials were given extraordinary authority to investigate the government's books. In 1878, Britain and France pushed for a ministry in which foreigners occupied crucial positions. The British financier Charles Rivers Wilson became finance minister. The Frenchman Ernest de Blinières took public works. Egypt still had an Egyptian ruler. But Europeans were now inside his government, deciding how the state should spend Egyptian money. That was the moment when Ismail's attempt to use European finance for independence turned completely against him. Years earlier, he had worked to free himself from Ottoman restrictions so he could borrow abroad on his own authority. European credit had looked like a tool that would make his government stronger. Now the governments behind that credit were limiting what he could do. Ismail tried to resist. Political opposition to foreign control was growing, and the assembly wanted greater authority over the budget. Ismail began aligning himself with forces that wanted the European ministers pushed out. In 1879, he dismissed them. It was an attempt to take back control of the state. Britain and France answered through the very imperial relationship Ismail had spent years trying to escape. Egypt remained legally part of the Ottoman Empire, which meant the Sultan still possessed formal authority over the Khedive dynasty. Britain and France pressured Sultan Abdul Hamid II. In June 1879, Ismail was deposed. The irony could hardly have been more complete. Ismail had sought greater autonomy from the Ottoman Sultan, including the freedom to raise European loans without Ottoman permission. Those loans had helped make Egypt so dependent on Europe that Britain and France could now use the Ottoman Sultan to remove him. His son Tawfiq became Khedive. The ruler changed. The anger did not. Egyptian officers had their own grievances, some of them much older than the debt crisis. Senior military positions had long favored the Turkish and Circassian elite, while native Egyptian officers often found their advancement blocked. Budget cuts made those inequalities harder to tolerate because careers and salaries were now being threatened at the same time foreigners were gaining more influence over the state. Among the Egyptian officers rising through that environment was Ahmed Urabi. Urabi had been born into a village family in the Nile Delta. He was not part of the old military elite, and by the early 1880s he had become one of the leading figures among officers demanding change. In September 1881, the confrontation moved out into the open. Troops assembled at Abdin Square in Cairo, outside the palace that Ismail had built as one of the symbols of his modern capital. Urabi and his allies presented demands to Tawfiq. They wanted the ministry dismissed. They wanted changes to the army. They wanted a representative assembly with genuine political authority. Tawfiq tried to resist. He could not. The Khedive gave way. For the first time since European financial control had begun tightening around Egypt, the political order backed by Britain and France looked genuinely vulnerable, and the army officers were no longer alone. Egyptian landowners had reasons to resent foreign financial control. Political reformers wanted constitutional government. Members of the assembly wanted authority over spending and taxation. Many Egyptians resented the special legal and economic privileges enjoyed by Europeans. These groups did not all want exactly the same thing, but Urabi became the face of a movement powerful enough to challenge the Khedive and the foreign influence protecting him. The phrase "Egypt for the Egyptians" captured the mood. For a moment, it looked possible that the country might actually reverse the direction of the previous decade. That possibility alarmed London. By now, Britain cared about far more than Egyptian bonds. The Suez Canal had become a crucial route to India and the wider British Empire. British investors had major financial interests in Egypt. Large European communities lived in Alexandria and Cairo, many protected by legal privileges that Egyptian nationalists increasingly resented. A government dominated by Urabi's movement might challenge the foreign financial arrangements. It might weaken Tawfiq, and from the British perspective, uncertainty in a country sitting across the route to India was becoming unacceptable. Britain and France sent warships to Alexandria. The idea was to apply pressure. Their arrival helped make the situation more dangerous. Alexandria was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the Mediterranean. The cotton boom had drawn Greeks, Italians, French, British, and other merchants into a port already populated by Egyptians and long-established foreign communities. Europeans had played an enormous role in the city's commercial rise, often under legal arrangements that placed them partly outside normal Egyptian courts and taxation. In June 1882, violence broke out in the streets. Egyptians and Europeans were killed. Shops were attacked. Rumors spread that further attacks were coming, and thousands of foreigners began leaving the city. Meanwhile, Egyptian forces strengthened Alexandria's coastal defenses. The British Admiral Beauchamp Seymour demanded that work on the fortifications stop. It continued. France, which had spent years working alongside Britain in Egyptian financial affairs, backed away from military intervention. Britain did not. On the morning of July 11, 1882, British guns opened fire. For most of the day, warships bombarded the forts defending Alexandria. Egyptian batteries fired back, but they were badly outmatched by the fleet offshore. Smoke and dust covered the waterfront. Fires spread through parts of the city during the chaos that followed. The port at the center of Egypt's cotton boom was now under attack by the country whose textile industry had helped create that boom 20 years earlier. During the American Civil War, British merchants had arrived in Alexandria, desperate for Egyptian fiber. Now British warships were arriving with shells, but capturing the port did not mean Britain controlled Egypt. Urabi's army still held the interior, and Cairo remained outside British hands. Egyptian defenses blocked the obvious advance south from Alexandria. The British commander, Sir Garnet Wolseley, decided not to force that route. Instead, he shifted the main campaign east towards Suez. British troops landed around the Canal Zone and took control of the route for military purposes. From Ismailia, they could advance west toward the Nile Delta and Cairo. That made the Suez Canal the central object in this story for a third time. In 1869, Ismail had used it to show Europe the future of Egypt. In 1875, financial desperation forced him to sell Egypt's company shares to Britain. Now British soldiers were using the Canal Zone as the base for an invasion of Egypt itself. Urabi tried to stop them. Egyptian forces fought the British at Kassassin and prepared a major defensive line at Tel el-Kebir, across the route toward Cairo. Trenches stretched across the desert. A daylight attack would expose British troops to fire long before they reached the defenses. Wolseley decided to approach in darkness. On the night of September 12th, British troops began marching across the desert toward the Egyptian position. Navigation was difficult. There were few landmarks, and the soldiers had to keep direction and formation while moving toward an enemy they could barely see. The plan was to arrive just before dawn. They did. In the dim light of September 13th, British troops attacked the Egyptian defenses at close range. Urabi's forces were caught before the entire line could react effectively. Fighting broke through the trenches, and the position collapsed with startling speed. What had been built as the main barrier protecting the route to Cairo turned into a rout. The British victory at Tel el-Kebir effectively ended the military resistance. Cairo was open. Urabi surrendered and was eventually sent into exile. Tawfiq remained Khedive, which gave Britain a convenient fiction. Egypt still had its ruler, ministries, and legal connection to the Ottoman Empire. British leaders could insist that the intervention was temporary and that troops would eventually leave once order and financial stability had been restored. They did not leave. Britain had not invaded Egypt simply to seize cotton fields. By 1882, the immediate stakes included Suez, imperial strategy, European investments, and a nationalist movement that threatened the political order Britain wanted preserved. Cotton's role had come earlier. The Civil War had transformed an important Egyptian crop into a spectacular windfall. That boom helped accelerate the expansion of cultivation and created an atmosphere in which Ismail's much larger modernization project looked affordable. When current revenues could not support the scale of that project, European lenders supplied the difference. When the exceptional wartime market disappeared, the loans remained. The debt crisis opened the Egyptian government to foreign control. The foreign control helped produce the nationalist backlash, and once that backlash threatened British interests around Suez, financial pressure gave way to military force. The crop did not cause every step. It helped create the conditions that connected them, and the story becomes even more ironic after the occupation. Britain inherited a heavily indebted Egyptian state. Creditors still expected to be paid, which meant the government needed dependable export revenue. Cotton remained the obvious source. British administrators invested heavily in irrigation and water management. These projects could genuinely improve Egyptian agriculture and make harvests more reliable. They also made it easier to produce the crop that generated the money needed to service the country's debts. The economic logic was almost self-reinforcing. Egypt exported raw cotton into a world economy where British industry had enormous textile capacity. British trade policy favored relatively open markets rather than protecting an Egyptian manufacturing sector behind high tariffs. Imported European goods could compete aggressively inside Egypt while cotton flowed outward. Under the occupation, dependence on the crop deepened. By 1914, cotton accounted for around 90% of Egyptian exports. More than 50 years had passed since the American Civil War created the original shortage. The extraordinary wartime boom was ancient history by then. Egypt had become even more concentrated around the same fiber. And in 1914, the political arrangement changed again. When the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War against Britain, London ended the legal fiction that Egypt remained an ordinary Ottoman territory under temporary British occupation. Britain declared Egypt a protectorate. The relationship that began with merchants buying cotton had passed through bankers, financial commissioners, ministers, and soldiers. That is the history hiding inside a luxury label. Walk into a store today, and Egyptian cotton means something almost completely different. It means quality. It means softness. It means a fiber long enough and fine enough to justify charging more for the finished cloth. Nothing on the package tells you that the name became globally famous during a war over slavery on another continent. Nothing suggests unemployed workers in Manchester supporting emancipation while their mills sat idle, or enslaved Africans being drawn into an expanding Egyptian cotton economy on the other side of the Mediterranean. There is no trace of Ismail watching European royalty sail through Suez while the financial foundation beneath his project was already changing, or of the same canal later becoming part of the route used by British troops marching against an Egyptian nationalist army. And the cotton itself never really failed. That may be the most important part. Egypt did not build its financial trap because the crop suddenly became worthless. Egyptian cotton remained desirable. It remained one of the best-known fibers in the world. What disappeared was the extraordinary moment when a civil war had removed the dominant American supplier and made Egyptian cotton far more profitable than normal. Ismail's ambitions lasted longer than that moment. So did the debts used to sustain them. If you like stories where ordinary things turn out to be hiding much larger forces underneath them, subscribe and tell me in the comments which part of this one surprised you most. Because the next time you see Egyptian cotton folded across a hotel bed or printed on the label of an expensive sheet, the softness will still be real, so will the history behind it. For a few extraordinary years, the fiber helped convince Egypt that it finally had the money to build its way toward greater power and independence. The boom ended before the ambition did, and the fiber that made Egypt rich became one of the threads that tied it to an empire.